If you're a working parent, you know how challenging it is to navigate the pressures of advancing your career while being the parent you want to be. Unfortunately, many of us put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be perfect at work and perfect at home. This week, I talked with Moe Carrick, a workplace culture expert who's on a mission to make every workplace good for people, because when people thrive at work, everybody wins. Here, we talk about Moe's decision to leave corporate America, the impact of the mothering myth, and the need for systemic change when it comes to working parents. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Moe. I'm so excited to have you here today, and I would love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself.
Hi, Kim. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you. So I am Moe Carrick, and I live in Central Oregon on the West Coast. I'm a consultant and coach. My company's called Momentum. I've been founder and CEO of Momentum now for 23 years, which is hard to believe. It seems like just yesterday I made the decision to go out on my own. And prior to that, I worked in a variety of different sectors, from healthcare and education to corporate in the tech industry. And in my early days, I cut my teeth on group work as a wilderness guide. So I worked for Outward and Knowles and Project Adventure, which is out near your way, working with groups mostly in a wilderness setting. I'm also the mother of 3, and I have a stepson as well. They're all grown. My youngest is 23. She was born the same year I started the business. So I have that challenge, and opportunity in life as a parent. And I'm married, I'm divorced, I'm remarried, and I'm looking at the back half right now. That's my stage of life a little bit.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I too had started my business when my son was an infant, and he was my older son. So it's a whole new world when you're trying to build a business and tend to a newborn at the same time.
It is. Yeah, it is. It seems easy at the time, right? You're like, oh yeah, this will be no problem. They don't even walk yet. But then you're like, wait a second.
Exactly. So what were you thinking about when you decided to leave? Like, were you feeling that there was either a problem that you wanted to solve on the outside, or were you feeling like you were just ready for a change? Like, what was it that prompted you to leave behind your former life and transition into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's something I thought long and hard about. I actually had tried previously. So about 5 years before I actually founded and started Momentum, I had made an effort to go out on my own. I remember printing business cards. I was going to call it Carrick and Associates, and had this cool logo. And at that time, it turned out that I really wasn't ready. Partly because I did love the work that I was doing. I worked with a woman, my mentor, who unfortunately died at a young age, not too long after I left the company that we worked for. But I really loved working for her. She was a really good boss, and I learned a lot from her, and I loved the work that we were doing. But what finally got me was the grind of the travel.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because as I think about it, there were actually 2 departures for me. So one was, I would say, when I left corporate America, which, I had some golden handcuffs. I was working in high tech at the time that it was really growing and scaling, moving from, I was in the cellular industry, so moving from analog to digital. I had a lot of incentive to stay. And then I had my first son. And that just brought my corporate career kind of grinding to a halt. Like I remember going back to work after my leave and I had to drop him at daycare and then I had to drive 30 minutes to the office and I had to pick him up by 5:30 and it was only a matter of weeks that I realized like I can't do this. I can't be the mother I want and hold this job. So I left corporate America at that time. I sort of downshifted, took a job in a healthcare setting that was more part-time. And then it was 5 years, actually it was more than 5 years after that, almost 9 years after that, that I founded the company, which was what I think of as my second exit. And at that time, it was because I was working as a consultant for that mentor that I mentioned, doing work that I loved, but I was traveling over 200 days a year.
Mm.
And by then I had two young children. I was getting ready to have a third, and I didn't feel like I was living the life that I could, around having some more flexibility. And I was really scared that I was not going to be having the impact on my own children's lives that I wanted. So I would say both times it was connected to the tensions that I felt between parenting and mothering and also trying to make a difference in the work that I did. I think that's what got me out.
Yeah, and you're hitting on a really important and I think a really challenging topic for so many of us as working moms, right? Is that navigating career success and parenting at the same time. And so, I think that, and I was actually having this conversation last week with a group about there's this drive that those of us who are achievers have to want to continue to grow our careers, challenge ourselves. We also want to be great moms and we want to make sure that we're available to our children, especially at all the major milestones. And it feels like we've been given lots of messages that tell us that we should be able to do all of that, right? So there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of self-doubt, a lot of guilt that comes with really not even balancing, right? But just sort of navigating these two really important roles.
Totally. Totally. And I think for me, some of that I now can look at in the rearview mirror relates to what I often call the mothering myth, which is sort of the disproportionate amount of pressure that is put on and also that we put on ourselves as women to be the iconic mother, and I think that that's actually really increased in my lifetime. I can remember, for example, in my own childhood, I grew up in New England where you live. And my parents were, I would call the way I was raised like benign neglect. You know what I mean? Like they were involved in our lives, but kind of on the periphery. I mean, they had their own issues. There was alcoholism in my family. There was career challenges. There was divorce, and so we did get raised, but kind of by the skin of our teeth. And yet, by the time I became a parent, I felt very much that there was a lot of pressure on being not just a parent, but like the perfect parent, especially as a mother. And so for me, and I think this is a phenomenon too, Kim, I'm curious what you think. I see it actually more in a more pronounced way impacting white women than some of my Black and brown and other ethnicity women who have articulated to me that they feel much more as though they haven't been able to just like lean into the guilt and shame of working because they have to work.
Yes.
Now, I had to work too. And so, which you maybe did as well. And many white women that I talk to, that's true. I mean, and we see this reality that women are in many cases today, white women and women of color are the primary income earners for their family, which I think, yes, it is related to ambition, but it's also related to meeting our basic needs. And what I find so troubling about the mothering myth is that it coincides with another myth, which is that the male partner should be the primary wage earner always, and that's his job. which puts us in this binary dynamic that actually is not what's real today, where we have many women with higher earning potential. We have men who would prefer to be carers and to stay home, but we're not getting permission in both directions. Women are not given permission to have the bigger career. They're facing the same challenges men have faced, which is that it feels like they have to sacrifice their family effectiveness in order to be on a corporate track or an entrepreneurial track. And then men similarly find that they're kind of yoked to the plow, that they're less than and inadequate if they're not working a full-time job or are flexing their hours. We see, for example, since I don't know what the last 10 years, many companies have been granting paternity leave as well as maternity leave. And in many of my client systems, men don't take it. And it's not that they don't want to take it. It's that they face the same dynamics women have faced, which is like, will I somehow sabotage my career if I take it? So I think the double bind exists for all of us, but it impacts women in a particularly toxic way, I think, that at least I was impacted by, around being able to stand in my own grounded confidence about, yep, I can actually be a good mother and I can do this really big job.
You said so many important things there, and I want to go back to the benign neglect because that is so fun. I think about that a lot. I mean, my mom was a single mom for much of my life, and the things that parents get involved with today, I laugh at because I think my mother wouldn't even know. The ways in which parents are so involved in messaging their kids' teachers, and like my mom wouldn't have been able to name my teachers or my I was like we scheduled our own. We didn't even call them play dates, right? You call up your friend and you go outside and you meet. Like, you didn't have parents transporting you all over the place. You played with the neighborhood kids, and it feels like you're a full-time coordinator for your children's activities on top of everything else that you're doing for your household and your work. And it's just such a different world that we live in today.
It is a different world. You're so right. And I think, there's a lot about that that's good, right? In terms of like safety and well-being. But I think there's some parts of it that are actually really not good. And, if you're familiar with some research, for example, by Angela Duckworth, who wrote the book Grit, who talks about how, the way we actually become resilient is through going through hard things. And so I think there's a real tension around I'm going to speak to mothering, which is the journey I know most since I haven't been a father, but which is that like there is a place of being the heroic mother of the year. Then there's being a good enough mother, and then there's being an inadequate mother. Right. And I think my biggest fear as a young mother was that I was going to be an inadequate mother. And I think sometimes I probably was, but most of the time, I think I was a good enough mother. And sometimes I was like really, really awesome mom, but I felt inside always like I wasn't doing enough, especially because I was very, very often the only person who traveled as much as I did and worked full time and supported my family through divorce and as a single mom and all that kind of stuff on my own. I felt like the only one. And so I didn't talk about my work. I just tried to show up as if I was like the moms who were at home, but I wasn't. It was a house of cards that I built that never really addressed what was real. And I think some of that's changed. I hope that some of that's changed for younger mothers today, but I get scared when I sometimes see that it isn't. Because what is it we can say to ourselves that helps us feel like we are good enough? And also that we aren't and we can't possibly do it alone.
Yes.
We just can't. We need a support system, and the support system can be the child's other parent. It can be extended family. It can be paid childcare providers. It can be school. It can be the friends. There's lots of ways. There's a whole network of ways in which any parent who's also working needs to be supported. Somebody has to take care of the children, and somebody needs to bring in the money. And if somebody is the same person, then they're going to need support. Yeah. So I think that's the key, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. And when you talked about not sharing that part of yourself when you were trying to just be like the other moms, anytime that we have to hide an important part of ourselves and our identities, what it does is it obviously compounds all of the stress and anxiety that comes with that, but it also shuts us off from those support resources
Totally.
that you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Because we can't be open about our situation. We can't get access
Yeah.
to that support, and so it just becomes that much more challenging.
Well, it does, and I remember you just brought up a memory for me. It's probably like a trauma memory, but I can remember back in the day when I was working for a consulting company before I started my own business, and I was working for that mentor I mentioned, and who was very supportive, and she really needed me to go back to traveling when my second child was very young, still an infant, maybe 6 or 8 weeks old, and she's like, I know it's going to be hard for you to travel from Oregon to Georgia, but like, could you please, because we've got this big client rollout and also, I'll help you have a nanny, either bring your nanny or have a nanny on the road. And I remember being like, okay, I think I can do that, talking to my partner and figuring out how I could take this newborn and still, do this work. But right before I got there, she messaged me and she said, now, it's awesome that you're here. So glad that we've got this, nanny arranged, but just try not to let the client see you with the baby.
Um,
And I'm like, what? What? I'm sorry. You know, what do you mean not have the client see me? Because we're going to be working from 8 to 6. And then I have to breastfeed this baby. We're still getting used to each other. Like the baby's going to be attached to me from 6 to 8, because that's how it is when you have a newborn. I can't hide the baby from the client.
wow.
But, the pressure she was under was it was almost 100% male client. She really didn't feel like it would be good to have people know that there
Mm.
was this infant around and this nanny. And I just remember feeling so like, okay, I'm supposed to hide that, this huge thing that's happening for me, which is that I have a newborn and I'm willing to do this work, but I also have to hide this part of myself. And I think that you're spot on there, Kim. It's like when we have to orphan any part of ourselves, and I say we in the collective, I think it's true for men and people that are on a spectrum of gender identity, any dimensions that we have to hide of ourselves eat away at our notion of who we are and what we're capable of.
Absolutely, absolutely. I can't help but ask, what did you do? How
Well, I complied. Like I tried to hide the nanny. We tried to, stick to the hotel room and I kept the baby. I didn't, I declined like some of the group dinners and stuff because I had to be, but it was really, really hard. I mean, I can remember coming home from that gig just physically and emotionally exhausted. I felt sad that I had missed some long days with my newborn because I was trying to show up well for this client. I can remember one day my milk let down in the middle of a session because I should have been breastfeeding and I wasn't because the session went long. And I just was like, oh God, I got these big splotches on my chest. Like it was hard, but I coped. I would say I limped along and I got through it.
Well, and I think in addition to when you're hiding yourself, you're compounding your stress and shutting yourself off from resources. There's also that belief that we internalize that I'm doing something wrong. I should be doing it somebody else's way, right? Like
Mm.
you're having to pretend you weren't there with a baby means you shouldn't be there with a baby and you're not doing it the right way, right? Which from a confidence perspective, when you're already in a tough situation and you're trying to do a good job, is only going to, make you that much more anxious.
Well, absolutely. And you're trying to do what you think is right.
Mhm.
Like that's, so I was trying to earn money so that my family could keep our home and have food on the table. I wasn't doing this because I had some outsized ego that required me to be out there proving something to the world. That's not why I was working. And for most people I know that are working while parenting, that is also true. They need to work for whatever reason. They also perhaps like working. They value the contribution they can make. It's engaging to their brain and their heart and mind, and that's all good too. But I think that you're right on around we make up that we are broken
Mhm. Mhm.
when really the systems that facilitate this process are broken. And I think it's true for many reasons for all of us, particularly around the tension between caring for children or elders and working. full time or even part time.
Mm. So, what do you see as the opportunity, perhaps, for women who are listening to this, nodding their heads, thinking, that's me, right? Like, well,
Right.
I think there's still, unfortunately, a stigma, and in certain companies, certainly more than others, certain industries more than others. But there are a lot of women out there who are afraid to even have the conversation with their manager. They don't want to look like they're less committed, or, ask for something that they're afraid will make them look different from their male counterparts. Like, how do we even start to address this?
Ugh, I wish it was farther along, Kim. Like I sit here at my age and with children that are mostly grown, and I think, gosh, it was supposed to be better by now. Like, so I have like a deep amount of sadness that it isn't. But how do we get there? I think we get there by having conversations like these. I think we get there by reality testing what it takes to help people that have children or elders that they're caring for contribute through work while also caring. I think we have to really look that in the face around what does that take and how can we design our systems, our workplaces to be good for people in that phase of life, which is temporary, right? Those 20 years or 18 years, it doesn't go on forever, but it is part of our lives. And I think that COVID, of course, has brought that all, the post-pandemic reality has brought it all crashing down, where, it used to be that mostly women were saying, like, we need flexibility as a currency. Now the whole world is saying we need flexibility as a currency. And I think the organizations that I see that are really being responsive to the workforce needs of tomorrow are really looking at how they do what they do to create the kinds of support that can help carers do both. And they're doing that with a mindset that says this employee is valuable to me. And they're going through a stage where they can't maybe work the hours that they once did, or they need more flexibility, or they need help with childcare, there is a childcare crisis right now happening as well, where people can't find the care they need, which doesn't help. So I think it does come back a lot to employers getting really creative and getting real with how they can support employees through this phase. And I also think for the individuals, we have to get a lot braver with what we're willing to talk about and name and own. And recognizing that there are some consequences to that, but that it too is temporary. And I'll give you an example. So when I was working as an external consultant, I I had two young children and I was traveling a ton. So before I left that job to go out on my own, I made a request of my boss to drop down my hours because I was traveling so much and I just felt like I needed to have a different pace in terms of my family. And I could afford at that time, my husband and I had talked, we found a way that we thought we could afford for me to work less than full time. So I approached my boss and I said, I'm thinking of dropping down. Could I go down to like 30 hours or something for a period while the kids are little? And she was great. She was like, absolutely, you can totally do that. And I just want to talk through what that's going to look like. And I was like, okay, what do you mean? And she said, well, right now you're one of our senior most consultants. You get a lot of the plum gigs. You traveled last year to Singapore, to South Africa. You're on the top gigs that we get. If you're working 30 hours, realistically, you probably will be not on those gigs as much. You're going to be more on the closer in gigs that are maybe in your region or in your state that can be accommodated with a part-time schedule. And you probably won't be the lead on as many gigs because the lead needs to be full-time. And I remember thinking about that and going, oh gosh, like I don't want, like I worked really hard in my career to be like the top dog. And she's saying to me that I'm going to have to be not the top dog if I want to work part-time, which on the one hand felt like, oh, that feels horrible. But on the other hand, it is what was real.
Hmm.
It is what was real. I actually couldn't do that big top dog senior consultant job while also working a part-time schedule. So I said yes. I was like, absolutely, I'm in. Let's do it. And she worked with me and came off some plum projects, but I got some other interesting work. And for a couple of years, that worked. But I appreciated her reality testing that with me. Because it wasn't the employer in that case couldn't actually do all the accommodating. I also needed to do some of the accommodating to get what I wanted. And it worked, so I think sometimes we have to, that was a palm sweaty moment because I didn't expect her to say that. I kind of thought I could just still be doing the kinds of work I was doing, but do less
Just,
of it.
yeah, scale it back. Yeah.
Right. And she was like,
Yeah.
nah, that's probably not realistic. And, it reminds me of I have a client who is a neurosurgeon, and she's the only neurosurgeon in her community. And she's a parent as well. And she's like, so, I can want to work less all I want. But the reality is, if somebody needs a neurosurgeon in my community, I'm in.
Yes. Yes.
So I've got to figure out how to handle that. And I've got to have support going back to that issue so that if my children who also need me, while someone needs neurosurgery, can have their needs met and be loved and cared for. It's on me. She was like, it's on me with the support system that I have to make that work. So I think that's where the courage comes in. And one of the biggest barriers I see for women like you and like me is that it's hard, let's face it, it's hard to ask for help.
Hmm.
It's hard to ask for help. So we instead hustle to try to do it all as if we don't need help. And if I had a do-over, like that's one of the things I would do really differently. I'd get better at asking for help.
I think that's a really good, I mean, hopefully people who are earlier in their careers and in their lives are taking that message to heart, because I do think that so many of us get to the point where we look back and think, if I had it to do over, I wouldn't have tried to do it alone. And I appreciate the conversation that you're sharing with us too, that you had with your manager, because I think there's a difference between reality as you're describing it and unfair penalties.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
I think it's hard sometimes to separate that out. Like, we have to be realistic about the fact that if you're going to spend more hours at work, you're going to spend fewer hours at home.
Yes.
There are only
Yeah.
so many hours in the day, and vice versa. If you're going to spend fewer hours at work to be able to spend more hours at home, it's going to affect your career in some way, right? And I think from a mindset perspective, because we've often been told we should want and should be able to have it all, that doesn't feel right to us. And it feels like we are doing something wrong, or that there should be a better way. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how do we make peace with that?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think part of it comes down to recognizing that although we are told we can have it all, that doesn't mean we can have it all at the same time. You know, like there are stages in life. I was talking to one of my kids about this the other day because they were reminding me how important my mother was in their upbringing. Because after I had my third child, my mother was semi-retired and she ended up jumping in a pretty, not full time, but like a pretty intensive care way. And I said, absolutely, thank God, I had her to do that, because at that point I was a single mom. But also before she did that, there were 9 years of the juggle, that I had to figure out without that support, which was much harder. And that's largely when I had to pivot to part-time. I think the other thing that has to happen is, and this might trigger some of your audience. It might even trigger you, Kim. I don't know, but it's something I'm passionate about, and yet I've had to look it in the face myself, which is until we as women can really get our head around believing and acting as though our male partners are competent carers, we will never have equity or equality at work. And I'm going to give you a little example of what this means. So I mentioned that I'm divorced from my kid's dad, and we're co-parents. We have been co-parents, both from a custodial care perspective. We had half-time care, and also from decision-making perspective, which was hard, real hard, but also good. Yeah. And I'll never forget when early in our divorce process, we were at an event. And for our youngest, who was singing in like her little, she was like in maybe first grade. She was singing in this little concert, and she was with him that week. So I showed up, went in the audience and sat with him and our boys, and we were watching, and she came onto the stage, and to me, she looked like she looked like a ragamuffin. Like her hair was like all over. She had like socks that didn't match. She had an outfit that wasn't in sync with all the other outfit. And my first reaction was shame. I was like, oh my God, everybody's going to be looking like our kid looks like the one who is not like well taken care of, really. I mean, she was clean and everything, but she just looked like a little funky. And I said, but I didn't say anything. I was like, all right, Mo, just sit with it. And of course, as soon as she opened her mouth, she started singing and she was so happy. And I saw this little face just up there, just with pride performing with her school. And I just got swept up into the like, oh, this is so amazing. And how much she loves, school. And she came up afterwards and she was so excited. And my her dad turned to me and he said, this was after the show, he said, I could really use your help with something, with two things actually. And I'm like, what? And he says, first of all, how do you put tights on a first grader who doesn't want tights on? And the second is, how the heck do you French braid hair? Right? And he was like, these two things, like we barely got out the door. I'm lucky she has clothes on. Like, this is tough. And I remember thinking, yeah, it is tough. It is tough. And good job, you. You got her hair. You were on time. She has clothes on. She had fun. She was singing. I had to let go of my crap. That's about this idea that there's a perfect way to do that. He was perfectly adequate, loving, caring father who was still learning about some of the custodial care that I tended to over dominate in. And it was better for their relationship and it was better for me that we had shared custody because I actually could make the kind of money I needed to support our family fully with him having primary care. But it wasn't easy, and we joke now because the kids look back on the rearview mirror. They're like, yeah, whenever we were at Dad's house, we had 4 meals. They rotated. And I'm like, but you lived.
You were fed. Yeah.
You were fed. You lived. And I think there's a lot of perfectionism. I'll speak about myself. I had a lot of perfectionism that actually kept my kid's dad from the beautiful, magical primacy that comes from being the actual carer until we were divorced. And at that point, there was no longer a protection. He had to do the things, and he did a good job. And it was different than how I did it.
You bring up such an important point, and I think that this is something I think about a lot because certainly over the course of my lifetime, I've seen a lot of changes in how we think about women's identity in the world, in the workplace. There are a lot more options available to women, everything from being a high-powered executive to being perfectly, it's perfectly acceptable to just take some time off and be with your kids.
Yes.
But men do not have that range of options available to them in terms of, sort of social acceptance and their ability to do that with pride and with confidence. And so we absolutely, in the same way that we want change in the workplace so that we can, sort of tear down some of the barriers and stereotypes that keep women from achieving the highest levels of leadership, need to be doing the same thing at home on the caregiver front to be able to say men can be caregivers just as effectively as women, even if they do it differently.
Absolutely. And in some cases, even better. But there's a lot that needs to change for that to be, I think, like viable for men. And I've known men who have taken on primary caregiving and they tell stories that are really tough. Like, gosh, I take the kids to the playground and I'm the only guy there. Or I go to a company event in support of my wife. She won an award and all the activities are spa days for the spouses, which it doesn't really appeal to me. Or I'm asked if these are my nieces and nephews, or I'm told that I'm babysitting my own children, and so I think that we as women have a big role in that around, getting our head around the fact that this is a partnership, that their children need their father or their other parental figure as much as they need us, and that there are different ways that we can do it that matter. But I think the mothering myth is what gets in the way of that. At least for me, it did. I had such a strong notion. I don't know where I even got it. I don't think my mother taught me this. I think I just like inherited from the world at large, which was like, I have to be all things to my children all the time.
Mm.
And it was a lie. It was a lie. For one thing, I only was half the parental unit.
Yes. And when you
Um,
come to believe that, like that's
yeah.
liberating.
Yes, it is liberating. It is liberating because there's less pressure,
Mhm.
on you, and it gives room for more variety of how the parents can show up because it does take all hands, at least for me, which then also frees up. Because here's the other thing, Kim, and I bet you see this all the time and I know you talk about this on the podcast. It also frees up some space if men can be seen as skilled and loving carers. It opens up a lot of permission for their own mental health and well-being and shared partnership, et cetera, because they don't have the unrelenting pressure to only be the earner.
That's
The
right.
men are making the money, like, come on. And so what that also helps then is for women to step into the economic power of being the earner and also of having ambition to solve real problems that matter. Because if all the women opt out of the big jobs that solve the real problems that matter, well, guess what? We're not going to get the solutions that we need.
That's right.
But I think women in many cases, because of the social pressure on the mothering myth, if they are childless by choice or by not, or they are choosing their career, even though they're a parent, they end up feeling diminished for their ambition and their earning. Women are seen negatively for those two things, where men are revered. So to me, when we think about men as competent carriers, it emancipates a lot of things, including, let's get real, with women's ambition and earning power, because it matters.
Yes. Oh my gosh, you're so right. And so many levels to what you're saying. And I think if men believe that their only option is to be the primary wage earner and to be as successful in their careers as possible, they're going to fight like hell to keep their status and their leadership
Yes.
positions within organizations, which is going to make it that much more challenging for us to reach any kind of gender diversity on a broader scale.
Yes.
And like you said, we get left out of the problem solving and all of the important decisions that are being made. And then men are also left out of the really rewarding family experience that so many of them, and I talk to them who wish that they had
Mhm.
more time for.
Well, and we see, like, when we look at one of my favorite studies is the Harvard longitudinal study on well-being, which has been going on now for 75 years, longest running study of like the conditions for human thriving. And what it says is that what really matters in the end is the quality and caliber of our relationships.
Mm.
And that study, of course, for many years was mostly on men because they were the ones that graduated from Harvard. Now we got both, all genders represented, but it's a great tragedy to me. And we see right now in the meta world of living in a time when we have a loneliness epidemic, men are suffering disproportionately from many of society's ills, from drug addiction to mental health crisis and high suicide rates for men and boys. So we've got some issues with how men are being supported for their identity of being enough,
Mhm.
if you're not a high earner. And unfortunately, I think what happens is that this separation happens at a very young age, where boys get on the track of I have to be the earner, and women get on the track of I have to be the mother, with the mothering myth. And now we're off to the races. And if that happens, if you're a woman and you're working, maybe you go to college or maybe you don't, and you get into a wage that's, a minimum wage as an adult, it takes Herculean effort for you to actually uptick your earning power by the time you're 30,
Absolutely.
right? And so the track happens. And so then pretty soon he has more earning power. He's trapped in he has to be the earner because she doesn't have earning power. And she's also trapped too,
Mhm.
and is then very vulnerable if the marriage doesn't last. Right. So I think that there's a whole different mindset, isn't there, around saying, hey, we need to create ways for it to be okay for women to up their earning power early
Yes.
and for men to be having healthy relationships early so that we get longer thriving. And of course, my lens is I'm a consultant and coach helping leaders make their workplaces fit for human life. And so all of this gets talked about in a healthy workplace for all gender identities and the childless and the people who have families to be able to talk about it. And it's vulnerable.
Well, and to that point, where are the organizations I mean, maybe there's a selection bias there. I don't know if you're dealing primarily with the ones that are willing to have the conversation, but what are you seeing in terms of their openness and willingness to even think about things in this way?
Well, I think it's interesting because what I'm seeing happening particularly around this issue of like equity is that the policies and laws have changed faster than the mindsets. So, for example, men are being given paternity leave and they can take, there's parity around how we are legally able to take leave and have flexibility, but we see a disproportionate underutilization for men than we do for women. And so I think there's that. I don't think there are enough organizations that are helping us shift the mindset. And I also think that there's a lot of work to be done around supporting men. One of my TED Talks is called Loving Men, Women's Role in Healthy Masculinity. I think that a lot of this work around real equity comes with, again, our courageous conversations in our homes as wives, partners, and mothers about debunking outdated notions of the masculine and feminine, because that's how we get ready to have it be more equitable at work.
Wow. I truly could talk to you all day. I really, truly could. It's such an important and such a timely conversation. And I may even offline talk to you about having you back where we can continue it.
I would love that.
But I really, just in the interest of time, I want to give you a chance to tell people, how can people find you if they are really interested, as I am, in your work and want to learn more about you?
Thank you so much for asking, and thanks for having me. I feel the same way. Like we could just go on, and we need to, right? Because these things matter. We want it to be better for our children than it was for us, And so I think there's just so much there. So thank you for like having the brave conversations to help people unpack and uncover like the wholeness of themselves, So people can find me at my website, which is momentum.com. It's that funny spelling because my name is spelled M-O-E. So it's MOEMANTUM. And I'm also very active on LinkedIn and also on Instagram, just in my name, Moe Carrick. And one of the things, there are two things that I think people might be interested in. One is that we have a free people and culture health check. It's on the resources page of our website, which is for anyone who's a leader or an entrepreneur who wants to assess, how am I doing in making my workplace fit for human life around things like this? How do we navigate flexibility? And the other is we have a really awesome guide that's actually a guide for gossip, rumor, and triangulation. We didn't even talk about that, but that's one of the tensions that comes up, I think, for women at work because of how we're enculturated to solve conflict. We learn to do it in a diffuse way. So that could be an interesting just PDF. If anybody wants that, you can just message me, send me the guide for gossip. And I'm happy to share that with you as well. But I'd love to engage with your audience on any of those locations. Just let me know that you heard about me through Kim's show.
Thank you so much, Mo. And I'll make sure the links are in the show notes as well. And just thank you for doing this work. It's so important. And I really appreciate your sharing it with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Great to talk with you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.